Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this first parallel session on financing the transition towards sustainable logistics and supply chains. Today's session is not about sustainable finance or impact investing, and it's also not about sustainable supply chains only or per se. So we're trying to find an intersection here, and I've been kind of wondering about what's financing of sustainable supply chains could mean. So we'll talk more about financial risks and profits, opportunities, long-term, short-term risks, business models and new business startups. And I'm very happy to have two excellent speakers here today. We were supposed to be three, sorry. But Anna Haberbosch from seedtrace unfortunately got ill, so she couldn't make it today. We'll use the time for more questions and more interactions in the session. But I'm very happy to have two great speakers here. Anna was supposed to talk from the perspective of a startup. So Anna is she's a founder of a small startup in Berlin. Martin Jacobs is the Director of Business Development of Shipzero, a scale-up, so not a startup anymore, quite some operations. The first time I walked into their offices, I was surprised by how many people are there. And then I'm very happy to welcome Cristiano Façanha, thank you, yes, from the Smart Freight Center. And Cristiano will talk more about how to finance transitions on a larger scale, on a systemic industry sectoral level. So thank you for being here. What we'll do is I asked all three of them to make 2-3 short pitches, 5, 6, 7 minutes. I think you can now take a bit more time, but we'll have the two presentations. They will tell us what they're working on, how finances matters in your work, your thoughts, and then we should have 20 minutes, 25 minutes for questions from the audience. We don't see everyone because of the flashlights in the back, but we'll manage. That's roughly the outline, and if you have questions, just raise your hand or say something. At the end, you will have access to the slides and contact details, so you can get in touch with at least the two of them after the talk or with me. My name is Johannes Meuer. I'm a professor here. Probably should have said that before. Well, I'm a professor for sustainable strategy and operations. Okay, so without further ado, Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for the nice introduction. And I'm really glad to be here. And I think I'm just going to position over here. Or? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yes, as you mentioned, you walked into our office already, which is actually located directly around the corner of here in the Speicherstadt. We are a software as a service company focusing on decarbonizing supply chains from a database perspective. So we are around 40 people in the office, and we precisely focus on transportation and logistics. So the question is, how can we actually enable companies to facilitate data-based approaches towards decarbonization in their supply chains, or from a forwarder or carrier perspective, transport service provider perspective, of course, also decarbonize their main business models and offer sustainable solutions to their transport buyers, clients. As mentioned, 40 people focusing on the topics of logistics, sustainability, and data, the intersection, because many of you who actually have engaged into the topic of data management in the transportation logistics industry know that this is quite fragmented on the one side. And on the other side, of course, it's necessary to track emissions on a global scale, to have an end-to-end overview and transparency about your transport emissions and logistics emissions in order to then define from there onwards what can be done in order to reduce the emissions. We cover all modes, of course, and we work, as mentioned, for different companies in the market, for different stakeholders that have different needs also. So on the one side would be the transport service providers, which are basically carriers, forwarders. The other ones are the transport buyers, of course, which need to track their supply chain emissions precisely, and which then also, of course, need to track their reduction potentials and their implemented reductions. why do we actually talk about that topic, of course? I think that's very present already. And why do we engage into that topic? So the one perspective, of course, that the logistics industry is the only big sector compared to energy, compared to production, and compared to agriculture, for example, which has still rising CO2 emissions compared to 1990 level, for example, but also compared to 2019 level. So the Federal Energy Agency, Environmental Energy Agency in Germany, for example, also just published a report which states that the logistics emissions are still rising, that we didn't meet the targets. But of course, on the other side, there needs to be a turnaround in order to then also meet those targets, to initiate the first activities and measures to go into the right direction. So what does it mean? It means that there needs to be a professional management and reduction of CO2 emissions. There needs to be an increased availability of emissions data and, of course, in the transparency of emissions data. But on the other side, that's also very correlated to our topic today. There needs to be an increased awareness towards costs that arise through carbon emissions in the supply chain. Because we believe, or we see that this is still underestimated. This will rise in the future, in the next decade, a lot by different factors. So on the one side, we have the EU taxonomy on sustainable finance. Companies will be rated, are already rated based on their sustainability activities, CAPEX, OPEX, and then are rated towards sustainability activities or not. Relevant for insurance, for loans, for example. The other fact which we see are basically connected to carbon emission trading schemes or emission taxes. So on the one side, we have the European trading scheme, which from this year onwards covers the maritime sector already. From 2027 onwards, the road sector will be covered. So this chart shows the price of around 93 euro. It's a little bit less at the moment, but still the environmental agency in Germany also expects that price to rise up to 200 euro until 2030, for example. So you can see already that the impact of CO2 emissions by the current pricing schemes will rise. On the other side, we have at the moment around 17% globally coverage of European trading schemes or emission taxes in place. And this is to be expected also to rise by 3 or 4 times. So you can imagine in global supply chains that this will, of course, have a massive impact on costs and cost planning, of course, in your transport logistics planning. What is necessary? So necessary in the market is to connect the dots between the different stakeholders in the market. We see the transport providers, we see the transport buyers. The transport buyers, as mentioned, they have low transparency often on their complex multi-layered scope 3 emissions. They need to know that, of course, they need the outliers in their transport chain to also then reduce those outliers. On the other side, the transport providers, they need to invest, of course, also in order to reduce their emissions, to do not have cost risk in the future due to more and more rising costs. I mean, we have the toll in Germany and in Europe, of course, already implemented since December last year in Germany. So those costs will more and more rise. And on the other side, those forwarders and carriers need to report to the shippers precisely, validated, verified, and in an automated way in order to have still the possibility to concentrate on their main business model, which is logistics, of course. So that's why it needs requires an informed and data-driven decisions in a unique platform or in unique neutral data space to share those data. Order data on the one side in ERP systems, for example, from shippers, transport information from forwarders and carrier companies in order to have a very precise overview of what is happening on each shipment that is delivered or each product line item that is delivered on a global scale. So we have a focus, of course, on the emission transparency in the first step. So as of now, many companies are not that well able to declare their emission reports in the transportation segment on a precise level, meaning shipment level, and then also see what is the influence of alternative fuels, for example, how has it developed in the past year, for example. Another aspect that the market is more and more tending to go into the direction of actually reductions in the supply chain, which need to be traced precisely and, of course, also validated. So we see more and more the concept of book and claim, which is also concepted by the Smart Freight Center. So happy to also talk to Cristiano here today, that actually enables transport companies to invest into renewable fuels, such as in the road sector, for example, HVO 100 or bio-LNG, and then allocate those emissions on the respective shipments and potentially then also market that in their communication to the transport buyer clients. And on the other side, the transport buyers, of course, have then a valid approach towards, okay, we were able to invest potentially into a carbon insetting approach, where we invested into our industry to avoid emissions instead of offsetting by investing into industry, not industry close sectors, such as offsetting or reforestation, for example. So that gives a unique chance, I think, to also decarbonize in the next decade. But this, of course, requires a very valid approach on tracking, needs a verification on the allocation of the emissions and the saved emissions, but that, of course, also delivers companies the potential to really plan. Okay, we will have on the one side the cost that will arise to trading schemes, to sustainable finance, but on the other side we can reduce those costs and have that kind of as a budget to investing into renewable fleets, to invest into the decarbonization through our partners in the transport network. What is Shipzero's role in it? Shipzero basically provides such kind of data platform to share data, to report data, and then also to facilitate the book and claim approach towards carbon insetting. So companies are already, as of now, able to report their emissions and then in the next step also decarbonize through the big book and claim approach in the road and mode sector and sea sector, for example. So basically our transport service providers are able to track their saved emissions and market that also to their clients. So we have a software as a service platform with various functionalities in there, focusing on seamless data management on the one side and seamless API connections to also internal systems that are in place, of course, already in, may it be ERP systems or CRM systems. Maybe to give you a little bit of a glimpse on what are examples of our customers and what they do. Bosch Siemens Home Appliance, for example, they track their global emissions for all their finished devices, basically, on a multimodal scale. And they do that as a basis towards setting goals towards a certain date, 2030, and then also to track those goals. So we, within the platform, also implemented an approach to see what is the market development to be expected until 2030, including, for example, electrification, where every second or third vehicle in 2030 will be electric driven. And then also what is the impact through the company and how is the company aligning with those market mechanisms and then also aligning with the targets. So they have a clear targeted set until 2030, which is based in this transport sector on the Shipzero approach on what can be implemented in the transport planning towards decarbonization. And having a little bit a look on the other side of the medal, the Jos Martens local player from Hamburg, actually, which is a transport operating company in the road sector, which already invests into biofuels, namely HVO 100, which has a reduction potential as of now already of up to 90%, depending on the livestock of the fuel. And this gives them, of course, on the one side already the opportunity to not wait on electric vehicles, which are not ready to have on a large scale at the moment, but on the other side also then market that to their clients. They already do that via the platform and go towards the section of decarbonization there, at least on a certain scale for certain products and certain transport structures, of course. So to summarize, with Shipzero, our mission is to enable effective emission reduction in global freight transportation. We believe in integrity of data management, that it's really necessary to have audit-ready results to be able to report precisely, and then from there onwards take the next steps towards decarbonizing the freight sector, because that is, as we saw in the beginning, necessary in order to hit targets and to avoid costs in the future. CO2 is not only a factor of how can we actually benefit the environment more than we did in the past, but also how can we benefit our business in terms of cost reduction and risk reduction on a global supply chain. So thank you very much. That's it from my side. So I'm looking forward also to Cristiano's talk now in a minute, and yeah, happy to talk later on as well.
Thank you, Martin. I think I'll just directly hand over.
Sounds good. No, thank you, Martin, and Johannes, like here. So, for those of you who don't know Smart Freight Center, like yet, so we are a environmental clean transportation NGO based in Amsterdam, but with offices in many other places, like as well. And then the goal is really to help the logistics industry to decarbonize, with the goal of achieving net zero by 2050. So we do that in 3 ways. One way is helping companies with emissions accounting. That's the area that we collaborate very closely with Shipzero in developing methodologies to calculate logistics emissions and making them very transparent. The second one is through our Smart Freight Academy. Therefore, the very close connection with Kühne Logistics University to help on capacity building of logistics professionals for decarbonization solutions. And then the third one is actually helping the logistics industry to decarbonize by helping them with collaborative projects. And that's the goal of today's presentation, doing a laser focus on electric trucks, like here, and more specifically, how to boost private investment on electric trucks. So this all falls within the concept of our Free Electrification Coalition. So it's a coalition of over 100 stakeholders. They're mostly shippers, fleet owners, who need help to electrify their fleets. And really the goal is to enable 30% of sales of trucks to be zero emissions by 2030 and 100% by 2040. So we are in very nascent stages, but we also have a crisis here. And then we think that with electric trucks, we actually have a solution. And so then the goal is really to accelerate the deployment of electric trucks through the aggregation of shipper demand. So they're the ones who hold cargo, are interested in reducing Scope 3 emissions and see truck electrification as a major strategy to decarbonize their logistics. And then send joint signals to policymakers so they can, input the right policies to support it, to manufacturers so they can produce more, infrastructure providers can build infrastructure, and carriers that can, feel more supported to actually buy these trucks. And then channel the demand for electric trucks through collaborative projects and partnerships, then promote solutions for infrastructure, advocate for policies, and finally activate an investor network to scale up these projects. So we talked about how truck electrification is in nascent stages, like today, but they're really prime for very accelerated uptake. But of course, there's a lot of challenges to be. So in terms of technology readiness, the technology is ready to attend most of the applications, maybe the very long distance ones. We still have some work to do. There are over 300 models out there for electric trucks, serving most of the applications, and can attend most of the duty cycles. In terms of the economics of it, these trucks will be cheaper to own and to operate, so total cost of ownership before the end of the decade. And then policymakers are already, particularly in Europe, in California, and other progressive states in the US, they have already establishing deregulations that will require, by 2030, at least 30 to 45% of sales to be zero emissions. And then, in terms of leadership, a lot of the fleet owners, the very progressive ones, they are on board. They really want to take this into their fleets. Now, a lot of challenges. Supply of electric trucks is still very low. Therefore, costs are very high. There is not a lot of infrastructure out there, other than infrastructure in private depots. And then A lot of the carriers are very small and medium enterprises with very limited borrowing capacity linked to this. So still like quite a bit of challenges. So the opportunity that we have here is really to launch, to scale, and to replicate specific projects for electric trucks driven by shipper demand. So this is something that we're currently doing. You know, we're going to get, like we're working on 2 to 5 projects, like right now. And then the goal is to activate an investor network, you know, to help these projects to scale. And then replicate these projects in other regions and in other applications. So there are 3 major drivers, like for truck electrification, finance being one of them. So there is a virtual cycle here between industry leadership, finance, and governmental policy. That industry leadership and accelerated action support strong policies and encourage investment. Scaled and consistent finance supports industry leadership and policies, and finally policies, in particular regulations, they can give the market certainty to invest and level the market playing field, like here. So these electric trucks projects, they fall within like an existing taxonomy of deployment use cases. Like, so the simplest one is a closed loop one, like usually you have one facility, and then the you know, the trucks, they go around, like, so very specific closed loop cycles. They return back to base, charge overnight. The second case is a regional, like, so it's a little bit more complex, but it still has a very clear base. Port drayage is a very clear example of that, but there is a regional distribution, multiple players. And then the third one is really a high-density corridor network. So that's kind of the holy grail for trucking, because that's where most of the fuel consumption and the energy consumption from trucking exists. And so we have a phased approach on how to launch, to scale, and to replicate, like these projects, all the way from building a network. So it's convening orientational dialogues, like with shippers, and educating them on the viability and the potential for electric trucks, build the interest. Then with those that are interested, you design the project, you launch it, and then after you launch, you scale and you replicate. There's a lot of different stakeholder levels like there. And then we have essentially 3 projects now that are in different phases of this. You know, some on the build interest and design, some already launched, and I'll mention a little bit later. And then in terms of the investor engagement, so like within this framework of launching, scaling, and replicating, you know, we have a parallel you know, process to invest to engage like private investors. And really their role is really on not launching, but scaling up these projects. Because that's the projects, they start like relatively small, like in nature, but it's through private investment that they're going to be able to be scaled. And the scaling can happen in different ways. It can happen like through private investment. It can happen through transportation as a service. It can be a book and claim like offering, like at the same time. So there are many different ways to do it. And I think this is my last slide. And so I was talking about the different projects that we're doing, like right now. And we next week, the Smart Freight Center is going to hold our Smart Freight Week event that in Amsterdam. And then we're going to be actually announcing these projects there. So very much encourage all of you to stay tuned, and like happy to answer any questions like here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not exactly sure how much time we have. 15 minutes, okay. So I just have, maybe I'll start with 2 questions, but then I want to open the floor to everyone. Since we're talking about finance, I was wondering, Martin, if you can tell us a bit about what you think are kind of challenges in securing finances for a company like yours, and maybe somewhat related, but Cristiano, you talked a bit about the challenges and drivers, but when I looked at the phased approach, how is that different for decarbonizing road freight than for any other large-scale project? I mean, just to contrast a bit too, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, shall I start? Yeah, mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, necessity to finance ourselves and risk and challenges there are, of course, multi-layered, I would say. One side is, of course, that we from our side need to see what kind of operations are really cost effective that we implement. Needs to have a kind of holistic approach also on short-term goals and long-term goals. Where do we want to go, and what are we able also to invest in order to get to this long-term goal, long-term potential, also sustainability goal, and if those short-term actions then hit the long-term goal as well. So that is, of course, already one layer. Other aspect is, of course, that we have our operations. We need to kind of scale the processes by still being able to not entirely be profitable, but also, of course, to communicate to our stakeholders, investors, for example, to facilitate the process that the different stakeholders are also satisfied. And I think there are different challenges from the communication, from the organization of the different stakeholders that are engaged to Shipzero, including clients and prospects, of course. And on the other side, the need also in the market, which is rapidly evolving, to also scale from our side, to have a larger platform, to engage more clients, and to foster product development, of course. So that is something where we precisely need to track what is the influence from each investment, also from a capex or opex side, and how does it align with our long-term strategy and with also the ambitions that we internally have and externally our stakeholders.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. So you asked me about whether this phased approach that we're doing for electric trucks also works, like with other decarbonization solutions for logistics. There's not a one size fits all to all of them. I think what they all have in common is that, like, any solution needs to start from a technical viability standpoint. And so when we think in terms of sustainable maritime fuels or like electric trucks, that's really where it all starts. And then when you get that hurdle, then it moves to an economic viability and operational at the same time, because it can be technical, but how do you integrate that within the operations? And then once you get to the economic viability, that's usually a total cost of ownership calculation. And then it's the financial viability. So sometimes, you can have economic viability, but the financial viability is something completely different because you have enormous capital costs that are involved. So I think that there are some commonalities in terms of where you move from technical to operational to economic to finance. But then, within those, the approaches are different.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the audience? Anyone here? There's a first question on the left-hand side.
Hi. All right. Good morning. Gordon Meuer, Professor for Logistics and Ports and Maritime. I have actually two questions. You talk about finance, and I saw the first countries you're going to work on is US, India. But when we think about financing the trucking industry in emerging economies, particularly, is even getting the truck owners access to the financial system at all, on the one hand. So what do you have any works on that sense? Because one thing is if there's a financial institutions in place and access, yes, but a lot of times it's not the case, particularly small owners. And the second place is, one thing is the availability of the trucks, and we know, yes, there are a lot of models out there, but there is a significant challenge of actually bringing sufficient capacity to the grid if you want to start charging these trucks. And it's there's a long discussion we have at least about, okay, do we have then charging station within the companies, but that is also inefficient investment. So how would you deal with that in public charging stations, and how would that be involved into logistics processes?
Oh, great, thanks for the question. There's quite a lot to unpack there. So in terms of the geographic focus, I think right now, the focus is really on those regions that have the best support network, from a matter of investment and policy, like support, like therefore, like really North America, like Europe, like China, India. So that's one, but it's also important to lay the foundation, in other emerging markets, so that we reduce the gap of technology development. It's like if we look in terms of how clean vehicles have been, emerging markets have always been on at least a 10, 15-year lag with Europe and North America. It's like we really need to reduce this gap, and we have an opportunity to do that now, and finance is a huge part of this. The second part was on the access to capital, and the fact that for every region likes to say that, oh, but this is in this market, 80% of the carriers are very small operators. This happens everywhere, by the way. So it is not a geography specific phenomenon. And at the same time, when we think in terms of those carriers that are purchasing new trucks, they're usually the very large carriers that purchase new trucks. They keep the trucks for 5-7 years, at most, and then they sell the truck to relatively smaller carriers, and then they keep reselling it, right? There's an element of equity, here, and the fact that we in a transition to a more sustainable future, we really need to give access to small and medium-sized enterprises, to new technologies as well. And again, that's where finance comes in. And so when we're thinking in terms of decoupling the battery costs from the vehicle costs, that's one way to do it. But really changing from a asset-based model to a service-based model. So that's another opportunity that we have here. And then you mentioned supply, very limited supply, here. It is true. That is how, when I mentioned those three drivers, the industry leadership, the government policy, and the finance, a combination of those three drivers are the most powerful ones to get manufacturers to completely change their business models and accelerate this level of production. And because that absolutely needs to happen. The most effective way is a combination of regulations and industry leadership advancing this projects. Those are the most important drivers here to get manufacturers to scale up production of this. You mentioned what was your question about the infrastructure piece?
The electricity capacity. I mean, I know in the US it's solved, but for example, when you think about any emerging economy, you probably have issues about the electricity provision and the structure of charging stations, right, in the logistics process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that is a matter of even in the most developed economies, there can be a significant delay, to get these charging stations online. Because they need to be in the megawatt charging level. So this needs to go hand in hand, but it's also not going to happen overnight. And so there are ways that you can start with closed loop operations where you don't really need a lot of grid upgrades. A lot of the charging can happen overnight with slow charging. And this is already being done, specifically with some companies working essentially alone with this. But as you moved from the closed loop model to the regional model to the high density, then that's where you actually need a lot of collaboration, because one company is not going to be able to do that alone. And and the collaboration does include the role of the charging point operators together with the utilities to front load those investments in infrastructure.
Who was first?
You want to say something about the
Yes, I think what Cristiano mentions, the collaboration across different stakeholders is something that is really important, and where we also see that there's not only one stakeholder who's going to invest into new infrastructure on the one side, and then also new vehicles or new vessels. So that needs to be a multi-facilitated approach towards how can actually can be made it viable to have a better approach towards not only CO2 emissions, but also cost effectiveness in terms of electric vehicles, in terms of biofuels, for example, because as of now also the governmental support for electric vehicles in Germany at least is at least a little bit reduced, I would say. No, but it's gone at the moment, and that's of course making it, especially for those smaller companies where I think we have 500,000 transport companies in Europe, it's making it extremely difficult to invest into this infrastructure from a vehicle perspective. So I think there needs to be a collaboration aspect between transport buyers who are also able to invest in, where then also the transport service providers are able to plan what can they actually reinvest or reintegrate into their financial planning, what can be together made with a shipper company. So that's definitely a huge point and needs to be taken in a collaborative way, not singly by shippers or freight forwarders or carriers, for example. That's for sure. Okay.
Yeah, Franz-Peter Kaiser from Bayer AG. If I understood both of you correctly, the decarbonization at this point, before we get maybe higher carbon prices, is dependent on willingness of shippers to actually pay more for low carbon transportation. And I would be interested, what's from your cross-industry perspective, how is that development? How big is that really? How much do they want to pay or are willing to pay extra inside and outside consumer goods industry?
I have some initial thoughts, like here, because some shippers are willing to pay a what they call a green premium for like solutions that because they are the solutions are in nascent stages, their cost is a little bit higher than your regular fossil solution, but it's not always the case. Like so I mentioned like in the presentation that for example electric trucks will be cheaper to own and to operate by the end of this decade. However, in some countries that have like strong financial incentives, such as the actual vehicle incentives and road tolls, in some countries electric trucks are already at cost parity, like with diesel, so they don't require a green premium. And when we look into the other side of the globe, for example, in China, there are a lot of applications that have already achieved like cost parity there as well. So the market is moving very fast. So I'm not saying that that there's not a need for green premium now. Yes, there is a need for green premium in many instances, but the market is moving very fast. And
Thank you. Yeah, maybe to add to that, I think that's very industry specific. So we of course have different companies from different industries involved, and I would say that there are certain industries like the chemical industry, for example, which is at the moment, for example, more at risk or more under pressure than other industries, so it makes it more difficult then also to invest into the reduction of CO2 emissions in the supply chain. But especially if you compare, on the other side, you have the pharmaceutical industry or FMCG industry, where we see already quite a lot of movements towards decarbonization, and especially if you compare it to the other side or the other option to decarbonize, which would be carbon offsetting, basically investing into reforestation projects, for example, then the industry more and more learns, I would say, that this is making, from a progressive point of view, also more sense to invest in those solutions instead of carbon offsetting. And I think that's a major level in the market that can be expanded also in the next years. But of course, always depending a little bit on the market and industry situation, and also on the business model, whether transportation has a heavy impact, for example, on your product carbon footprint in total. Those are dependencies that play a major role as well there.
Can I make a very quick, because I knew I had something else to say, and I just thought about it. you mentioned that we need industry to be willing to pay more for this, and I addressed that. But it's really important to talk about the strong role of policymakers, like here, and because it's really with very strong policies that you can actually level the playing field, like for everybody. And if you level the playing field for everybody, then the costs go down, like for everybody as well. And there is a strong link between industry and policy. So if industry is showing leadership, policymakers are more confident to actually enact these policies, and vice versa. If you enact like the strong policies, so the industry leaders are not going to have to upfront like all of that bill themselves, because that bill is going to be shared like amongst the whole market.
Unfortunately, I have a time restriction here, but I'm very tempted to. Let's take one more question. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Jens Nielsen. I represent a shipping company, so we have nothing to do with trucking or anything like that. What I would like to ask you, Cristiano, is what I'm missing in this whole discussion we have here about decarbonization of transportation. It's common knowledge that the most efficient and most economic way to move a product from A to B is with a ship. And in our industry, we are looking at alternative fuels such as ammonia. Ammonia is the new black for the time being, but we have been talking about hydrogen. LNG is seen as a bridge fuel. But isn't it about time that we take an honest approach to this whole thing where we get most bang for our bucks, as I would like to say it? Shouldn't we use the very precious alternative fuels elsewhere where we get more value out of the fuels than in burning them off on a 24,000 TEU container ship, where you only have for instance, if you compared hydrogen to 0.1 gas oil today, you need about four times more hydrogen to achieve the same power on a vessel. And I think we are wasting good green energy, which can be spent more intelligent than trying to use that for a modern container ship.
No, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, when I was like doing the presentation specific about trucking, but when you think from a logistics standpoint, shipping, and then like rail, from an energy like efficiency standpoint, are like more effective than trucking for most of the lanes, like of course, and I think it's also important to like allocate, the right fuels to the right modes. And in particular, like, so for example, when we talk about biofuels, like today, there are different types of biofuels, right? So there are biofuels, they're first and second generation. It's a lot of like uncertainty out there whether they have any environmental benefit because of indirect land use change. And it's only with waste-based biofuels that you really have like a really big savings. The problem is that you have a very limited supply of waste-based biofuels, and you should really allocate them like to those modes that are even harder to abate than trucking, right? So, for trucking, there is already like a viable alternative. Like in the near term, it is battery electric. Like in the long term, it will likely be a combination of battery electric and hydrogen. But the truly sustainable biofuels like should really be allocated to different and harder to abate sectors like shipping, for example, and aviation.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm already getting into trouble here, so a big applause. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have two presents. If you want to get the slides, it should work with the QR code, and if it doesn't work, send me an email. It's very likely it doesn't work. Yeah, sorry, I only have one hand. Yeah, I think this was only a start of a debate. I took a lot of notes. Most of my questions are not addressed yet, so I hope you use the opportunity to get in touch and talk more. And now is another coffee break. 10 minutes coffee break. Thank you very much.